The sound was wrong. That's what the new homeowner would say later. The sound his shovel made when it hit. He was digging a hole for a crabapple tree. A small thing for his daughter who wanted something pink to bloom outside her window. The afternoon sun was warm on his back. The Utah soil in this particular spot softer, darker than the rest of the yard. He'd hit rocks before, a dull thunk. This was different. A hollow, fibrous crack. He knelt, brushing away the loose earth with his hands. It wasn't a root. It wasn't a stone. It was stained, treated wood, old and partially rotted. Curious, he pried it up. Underneath, wrapped in heavy, disintegrating plastic, was a shape. A shape that looked too much like a handle. He called his wife over. Together, they pulled back more plastic. What emerged from the earth, after 28 years, was the head of a sledgehammer, caked in dirt but unmistakable, and stained with something dark that wasn't rust. They stopped digging. They called the police. And in doing so, they unlocked a door to a past everyone had tried to forget, revealing that the truth about a young woman's death had been sleeping, patiently, just beneath the grass where children played. For 28 years, the file for Crystal Lynn Beslanowicz sat in a cold case cabinet, a puzzle with half the pieces missing. The investigation wasn't lazy. Dozens of detectives had poured hours into it. Leads were chased. Suspects were interviewed. But the case hit a wall again and again. It wasn't a lack of evidence. In fact, critical evidence was collected within days of the crime. The problem was a story everyone believed, the police, the media, even the public, about who the victim was and where the crime must have happened. That story was a cage. It kept the investigation looking in one direction, while the answer lay in the opposite, buried in the most ordinary of places. By the end of this video, you'll see how one narrative, one assumption about a life, can blind an entire investigation. You'll understand the forensic patience that finally broke the case open, and you'll hear how the psychology of the killer was revealed not in a dramatic confession, but in the calculated, quiet act of digging a hole in his own backyard. This is Behind the Crime Files. We examine the mechanisms of real crimes, the choices made in the shadows, and the often overlooked details that finally bring the truth to light. To understand the weight of what was found in that backyard, you have to understand the world Crystal Beslanowicz inhabited. She was born in 1978. Her childhood, by all accounts, was fractured. She spent time in the foster care system in and around Salt Lake City. By her mid-teens, she was a survivor, navigating a world that offered few safe harbors for a young woman on her own. She struggled, as many do, with the instability and the search for belonging. Police reports and later interviews with those who knew her briefly describe a girl with a gentle demeanor, a soft voice, and a smile that seemed hesitant but genuine. She loved music. She dreamed, as teenagers do, of a life that was calmer, more secure. In the summer and fall of 1995, Crystal was 17. Her life was transient. She moved between temporary shelters, the homes of acquaintances, and the streets. Her world was the streets and margins of Salt Lake County, a landscape of fast roads, strip malls, and not far from the urban sprawl, the rugged, cold beauty of the Wasatch Front Mountains. Her life was a series of unpredictable days and uncertain nights. But it was her life. And on December 6, 1995, that life was taken from her. The people who briefly shared her path would remember that date not as a turning point, but as the day Crystal simply vanished from the pattern of their lives. The alarm wouldn't sound for days. In a life of movement, her absence was, tragically, not immediately strange. The official record begins with discovery, not disappearance. On December 19, 1995, 2 weeks after Crystal was last seen alive, a worker for the Utah Department of Transportation was performing routine maintenance along State Road 71, near the Little Cottonwood Creek in Midvale. His job was to check the drainage. What he found was a human form, partially submerged in the shallow, icy water near the creek bank. He called the police. Uniformed officers from the Unified Police Department of Greater Salt Lake arrived first, securing a grim scene. The body was that of a young female, fully clothed, lying face down. There were visible injuries to her head. Detectives from the homicide unit were notified and took over. The first task was identification. Fingerprints matched those of Crystal Lynn Beslanowicz, who had been reported missing a few days prior by a concerned acquaintance. The medical examiner conducted the autopsy. The cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head. The nature of the injuries suggested multiple, powerful blows with a heavy, solid object. There was no evidence of a significant struggle at the creek site, no torn clothing from bushes, no scuff marks in the earth suggesting a fight where she lay. This immediately suggested to investigators that the creek was a dump site, a secondary location. Crystal had been killed somewhere else and transported to this remote spot to be left in the water. The investigation now had a focal point: find the primary crime scene. Detectives canvassed the area around Little Cottonwood Creek. They knocked on doors in sparse residential neighborhoods nearby. They searched for any reports of suspicious activity, strange sounds, or unfamiliar vehicles in the area on the night of December 6th or in the early hours of December 7th. The creek area itself was processed for evidence, but the pickings were slim. The water and the passage of time had degraded potential forensic evidence. The killer had chosen well. Attention then turned to Crystal's last known movements. Through painstaking interviews with people in the transient community, detectives pieced together a fragment of her final hours. She was last seen alive in the vicinity of North Temple Street in Salt Lake City, an area known for its motels and street activity. Witnesses reported she was in the company of a man. Descriptions were vague: white male, possibly in his 30s or 40s, average build. They were seen getting into a vehicle, but no one could recall a make, model, or plate. It was a dead end painted in broad, useless strokes. The prevailing theory formed quickly, shaped by the environment. Crystal, engaging in survival sex work to get by, had encountered a client. That encounter had turned violent. She was killed, likely in a vehicle or a cheap motel room, and then driven to the creek and discarded. The investigation, therefore, focused on the world she moved in. Detectives began compiling lists of known sex offenders, violent criminals who preyed on vulnerable women, and men who frequented the North Temple area. It was a logical approach. It was also the beginning of the tunnel vision that would keep this case cold for decades. But from the very beginning, there were details that quietly challenged that narrative. Details noted in evidence logs and detectives' memos, but ultimately overshadowed by the louder, more obvious theory. First, the condition of Crystal's clothing. While her body showed horrific trauma, her jeans, shirt, and jacket were relatively intact. They were soiled from the creek and the elements, but they were not torn or ripped in a way that suggested a prolonged, violent struggle in a confined space like a car. There were no defensive wounds on her hands or arms. This pointed to a sudden, overwhelming attack or an attack where she was in some way restrained or unable to fight back. Second, the forensic collection at the autopsy. The medical examiner collected crucial evidence: biological material from under Crystal's fingernails, standard procedure in a homicide. This suggested the possibility of a physical struggle, of her scratching her attacker. This evidence was bagged, logged, and sent to the state crime lab. But in 1995, DNA technology was in its relative infancy. The process was slow, expensive, and required a substantial sample to produce a usable profile. The material collected was stored, awaiting the day technology might catch up to it. The third, and most significant detail was the complete absence of the murder weapon. A bludgeoning death requires a heavy, solid object. A hammer, a pipe, a rock, a sledgehammer. That object would be covered in biological evidence. It was the single most important piece of physical evidence connecting the killer to the crime. And it had vanished. Investigators scoured the creek area, dragged sections of the water, searched the banks. Nothing. They considered the possibility it was thrown from a bridge or carried away. But its absence was a gaping hole in the case. If the killing happened in a moment of rage during a transaction in a car, why would the killer meticulously remove the weapon? Wouldn't it be more likely to be left at the scene or tossed hastily nearby? The removal of the weapon suggested forethought. It suggested a cleanup. At the time, These inconsistencies were acknowledged but filed under questions to be answered later. The immediate, pressing work was in the streets, following the trail of Crystal's life. The later for those questions would be 28 years away. Let's pause here and consider the psychology at play, both in the investigation and, as we would later understand, in the killer. From an investigative psychology standpoint, the early focus on the transient community and street-based crime is a classic example of heuristic-driven investigation. A heuristic is a mental shortcut. When faced with a complex problem, an unsolved murder, the mind seeks a known pattern to apply. The pattern here was tragically common. A vulnerable young woman involved in high-risk behavior becomes the victim of violence from someone within that milieu. This is a pattern detectives had seen before. This heuristic allowed investigators to act quickly, to focus their energy on a defined population. But it also risked filtering out information that didn't fit the pattern. The lack of a struggle on her clothing? Perhaps the killer overpowered her quickly. The missing weapon, thrown in the river. Every inconsistency could be rationalized within the framework of the initial assumption. Now, consider the killer's psychology as implied by the evidence. The act of moving a body is significant. It is a high-risk behavior. It requires a vehicle, it exposes the perpetrator to being seen loading or unloading, it leaves forensic transfer evidence, fibers, hair, soil in that vehicle. A person acting in a spontaneous, explosive rage rarely engages in this complex secondary step. The emotional crash after a violent outburst typically leads to flight, not careful logistical planning. Therefore, moving the body indicates a shift from emotional action to cognitive action. The killer's primary goal is no longer the act of violence itself, but the management of its consequences. This is a sign of control. It also strongly suggests that the primary crime scene, the place where the violence occurred, held importance to the killer. It was a place he needed to protect, to keep separate from the act. A stranger's car or a motel room rented for an hour doesn't need protecting. You simply leave. But your own home? Your own property? That is a place of identity, of safety, of connection to your normal life. That is a place you must defend at all costs. The disposal of the body at the creek wasn't just about hiding the victim. It was about creating distance, redirecting the investigation's attention away from that important place. Furthermore, the removal and hidden retention of the murder weapon is deeply psychologically telling. Discarding it in a random location is one thing, but hiding it, burying it, keeping it secret, suggests the weapon itself had a power, a meaning. It was a tangible connection to the act that the killer felt compelled to keep, but to keep hidden. It's a form of trophy-keeping, but one shrouded in shame and secrecy, not displayed for pride. This points to a personality that compartmentalizes. A person who can section off a horrific act into a box, bury that box both physically and mentally, and then return to a surface-level normal life. This isn't the profile of a chaotic, impulsive predator of the streets. This is the profile of someone with a fixed address, a routine, and a secret. But the most disturbing part of this story isn't just the killing or the disposal. It's the long silence that followed. For 28 years, while Crystal's family grieved without answers and detectives retired with the case unsolved, the person responsible lived with his secret. He went to work. He maybe raised a family. He mowed his lawn. He walked over the spot where he had buried the truth. And the entire time, the key to solving the murder was not in some dark alley or police file. It was in the ground, waiting for the world to forget, and for science to remember. In the years following Crystal's death, the investigation followed the track laid down in those first weeks. Detectives identified and interviewed multiple persons of interest. These were men whose names came up in the canvas of the street, men with histories of violence against women, or men who were known to solicit sex workers. One early focus was a man Crystal was known to have associated with sporadically. He had a record for minor assaults. He was interviewed extensively. He admitted knowing Crystal but claimed he hadn't seen her in weeks. His alibi for the night of December 6th was shaky but could not be definitively broken. He consented to a search of his vehicle, which revealed no forensic links to Crystal. Without concrete evidence, detectives could not hold him. Another suspect emerged a few years later. A man arrested in a neighboring state for a violent assault on a woman bore some similarities to the vague description from North Temple. He was extradited to Utah and questioned for hours about Crystal's murder. He denied any involvement. Again, without physical evidence to place him with Crystal or at the creek, the interrogation led nowhere. He was returned to face charges for his other crime. Throughout the 1990s and early 2000s, the case was periodically reviewed. New detectives would pull the heavy file, read through the witness statements, the autopsy report, the lists of interviewed subjects. They would re-interview old witnesses, whose memories had faded further. They would chase down new tips that came in, often vague and leading nowhere. The case became a graveyard of what-ifs. What if that one witness had gotten a license plate? What if the motel clerk had kept better records? The investigation remained trapped in the geography of the street and the creek. The theory seemed sound. On paper, it made sense. A high-risk victim, a high-risk lifestyle, a violent end in a secluded area. It was a story that, tragically, people could understand, even expect. But the case file kept growing thicker without ever pointing to a conclusive answer. The evidence that did exist, the DNA under the fingernails, was a silent, waiting witness, but one that could not yet speak clearly enough to point the way. The turning point did not come from a confession, a deathbed revelation, or a lucky break in the field. It came from a quiet room in a laboratory, and from the relentless march of scientific progress. By the late 2010s, forensic DNA technology had undergone a revolution. The development of advanced techniques like polymerase chain reaction, PCR amplification, and later, massively parallel sequencing, meant scientists could create a DNA profile from a sample hundreds of times smaller and more degraded than what was required in 1995. The Utah State Bureau of Investigation's Cold Case Unit made a decision. They would revisit old, unsolved homicides where biological evidence had been preserved but was previously unsuitable for testing. Crystal Bislanowicz's case was chosen. In 2017, the evidence collected from beneath her fingernails was removed from its long-term storage. Forensic technicians, using these new sensitive methods, were able to extract a male DNA profile. This was a major breakthrough. For the first time, they had a genetic fingerprint of the person who was, in all probability, Crystal's killer. But a profile in a database is just a string of numbers unless it has something to match against. It was entered into the National CODIS database, the Combined DNA Index System, which contains profiles from convicted offenders and arrestees. There was no hit. The killer had no felony conviction that would have required him to submit his DNA. He was, in the eyes of the law, unknown. This is where the story takes its next dramatic leap into the world of investigative genetic genealogy. Around 2018, this technique burst onto the forensic scene, most famously with the identification of the Golden State Killer. The principle is this. While the killer's DNA might not be in a criminal database, they have genetic relatives who have voluntarily submitted their DNA to commercial genealogy websites like Ancestry.com or 23andMe for family history research. By uploading the forensic profile to these public databases, through approved, legal channels with specific genealogical services used by law enforcement, skilled genealogists can build a family tree for the unknown suspect. They start with distant cousins, third, fourth, fifth cousins, and work backwards, using public records like birth certificates, marriage licenses, and obituaries to find common ancestors. Then, they work forwards down the family lines, identifying all the descendants of those ancestors. Through a process of elimination, considering age, location, gender, they can narrow the list down to a very small number of individuals who could be the source of the DNA found at the crime scene. This is precisely what happened in Crystal's case. The DNA profile from under her nails was submitted for genetic genealogy analysis. A family tree began to form, a sprawling map of connections across the western United States. Genealogists, working in tandem with Salt Lake County's Cold Case Homicide Unit, followed the branches. They eliminated lines that led to women, to men who were too young or not alive in 1995, to men who lived out of state with no connection to Utah. Slowly, meticulously, the tree began to collapse inward, its branches converging on one man. His name was Joseph Michael Simpson. Born in 1953, he was 42 years old at the time of Crystal's murder. He had lived in the Salt Lake Valley for decades. He had a record, but it was for nonviolent, mostly traffic-related offenses. Nothing that would have put him on the radar of homicide detectives in 1995. He was a ghost in the machine, invisible to the heuristic that drove the early investigation because he didn't fit the pattern of a street predator. He was a family man. He worked regular jobs. He lived in a house. And in 1995, he lived at a specific address in Midvale, Utah. An address less than a 10-minute drive from Little Cottonwood Creek. With Joseph Simpson identified through genetic genealogy, detectives now had a new mission. Gather enough probable cause to obtain a direct DNA sample from him or his belongings to confirm the match. But there was a problem. Joseph Simpson had died in 2013. He had taken his secret to his own grave, a decade before his name surfaced. This changed the legal strategy. The goal was no longer an arrest, but a confirmation and, if possible, the discovery of further evidence to close the case definitively and provide answers to Crystal's family. Investigators began a deep background investigation into Simpson's life. They learned about his work history, his family, his habits. Most importantly, they zeroed in on his residential history. They confirmed he was living at a specific house on Rose Street in Midvale in December 1995. They interviewed old neighbors, who recalled him as a quiet man who kept to himself. No one remembered anything suspicious around the time of Crystal's murder. The most critical piece of the puzzle was the house itself. Simpson had lived there for several years in the 1990s. If the psychological assessment was correct, if the primary crime scene was a place of importance to him, then this was the place. The murder likely occurred there. And if he had gone to the trouble of moving the body and keeping the weapon, where would he have hidden that weapon? Not in the house where a family member might find it. The backyard offered privacy, control, and permanence. In February of 2023, the Salt Lake County District Attorney's Office, along with the Unified Police Department, applied for and was granted a search warrant for the property on Rose Street. The affidavit for that warrant, now a public document, lays out the entire genetic genealogy journey and posits the theory that evidence of the crime, specifically the murder weapon, may be buried on the premises. The current homeowners, who had purchased the property years after Simpson had moved out and died, were completely cooperative but understandably shocked. On a cold morning in February, a team of detectives and forensic archaeologists arrived. They didn't start digging at random. They used ground-penetrating radar, GPR, a device that sends radio waves into the ground and measures the reflected signals to identify disturbances in the soil. The GPR scan revealed two distinct anomalies in the backyard. Irregular shapes at a depth of about 2 feet that were not natural rock formations. The excavation began. It was methodical, careful, filmed for documentation. At the first anomaly, about 6 feet from the back porch, they found it. A homemade container. A wooden box, rotting and collapsed, wrapped in thick, black plastic sheeting. Inside that container was a sledgehammer. The head was stained with dark, oxidized material. Next to it, also wrapped, were other items. A woman's shirt, a pair of jeans, and some costume jewelry. The clothing would later be confirmed through forensic testing to contain Crystal Beslanowicz's DNA. The biological material on the sledgehammer was a match for Crystal. Joseph Simpson's DNA was also found on the clothing, a result of transfer during the attack and handling. The truth was now unearthed, literally. Joseph Michael Simpson had murdered Crystal Beslanowicz in his home on Rose Street, likely in the garage or a secluded room, in December 1995. He had then wrapped the murder weapon and her belongings, items that could directly link the crime to his address, in plastic, placed them in a box, and buried them in his backyard. He had then placed Crystal's body in his vehicle, driven the short distance to Little Cottonwood Creek, and left her there, hoping the water and the remote location would either destroy evidence or misdirect the investigation entirely. This wasn't a crime of passion in a stranger's car. It was a planned, controlled sequence of events. Violence, cleanup, concealment, and disposal. He hid the heart of the evidence in the last place anyone would associate with a transient girl's death, beneath the manicured lawn of his own suburban home. He then proceeded to live the rest of his life, through multiple moves and years, never speaking of it. The backyard burial was the ultimate act of control and compartmentalization. He couldn't part with the weapon, the proof of his act, so he kept it. But he had to hide it, even from himself, by putting it in the earth. It was a secret garden of violence. The announcement of the case being solved was made in a press conference in the spring of 2023. For Crystal's surviving family members, a sister, aunts. It was a flood of long-delayed, complex emotions. There was relief in finally having a name, an answer. There was anger that Simpson had died without facing justice. There was a profound sadness, reawakened. For the young woman whose life was so brutally taken, they could now visit a grave or a memory with the knowledge of who was responsible. It provided a form of closure, but not the kind that comes from a courtroom verdict. For the detectives, both past and present, it was a moment of professional vindication mixed with frustration. The cold case detectives who worked the genetic genealogy were elated to have solved a decades-old mystery. But the original investigators, some retired, reflected on what might have been. Could they have seen past the initial narrative? Could they have widened the suspect pool? The technology simply didn't exist then to follow the DNA trail. They had worked the case with the tools and the understanding they had at the time. The case is a stark lesson in the dangers of cognitive biases in policing and the transformative power of forensic patience. For the current homeowners of the Rose Street property, life was permanently altered. Their backyard, a place of barbecues and play, was now a piece of criminal history. They had to process the knowledge of what had happened there and what had been hidden under their feet. They became, unwillingly, the final chapter in Crystal's story. And for Joseph Simpson, his obituary from 2013 paints the picture of an ordinary man. It lists surviving family, hobbies, a life lived. There is no mention of Crystal Bislanowicz, of the box in the backyard, of the secret he carried. His legacy is now forever split. The public face remembered by his family and friends, and the hidden face revealed by science, a man capable of a calculated, brutal act and a decades-long deception. His burial of the evidence was an attempt to kill the past. Instead, he preserved it perfectly for the future to find. The act of burying the murder weapon in his own yard, rather than discarding it in a river or dumpster, is a profound psychological clue. Do you believe this action was primarily one of practical concealment, or did it serve a deeper, more symbolic function for Joseph Simpson? A way to ritually put the crime to rest while still keeping its power close? Furthermore, if you were advising a cold case unit today, what one non-technical practice, beyond using genetic genealogy, would you emphasize to prevent the kind of investigative tunnel vision that kept this case cold for so long? If you are interested in the psychology of crime, the stories behind the headlines, and the forensic breakthroughs that crack impossible cases, subscribe to Behind the Crime Files. We delve deeper so you can understand more.